Welcome back, everybody, to the Therapist Confidential podcast. I'm your host, Travis Heath, and today we welcome in Brooke Sheehan. She is the director of an intensive mental health unit in a correctional facility, which I think is something lots of people that are curious about working in correctional facilities, working in prisons, and wondering about what's the reality of that. Is it safe? And they wonder, well, it pays a lot of money, at least a lot of the jobs do, so maybe I should check it out. But I think there's a lot of sort of myths about it, and rarely do we hear from someone who actually is on the ground and has been doing this work. And we get to do that today. So I'm really excited. Brooke, welcome to the show. And if you don't mind, can you introduce yourself to the people?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Brooke Sheehan. I am a social worker. I also have my doctorate in social work. I have been working in correctional and behavioral health for about 10 years. My role has shifted a little bit, so I'm now the regional behavioral health director for our services in the Northeast correctional environment. But still very much have my footing in the intensive mental health work. That's definitely my passion. But I've done a broad spectrum of things. So now it encompasses working with women, juvenile, men, folks with serious mental illness, substance use, problem sexual behavior, all across that gamut in corrections.
Wow. Yeah, that is a ton of experience. First, if I can ask you, you're a social worker by training, which I think is interesting. Systems definitely influence the way I think about the world. I'm wondering if you can talk some about how systems influence the work you've done in these settings.
Oh, totally. I love that question. I think it infiltrates everything. I mean, that's my lens, I guess, anyway, right, as a social worker. But I feel like there's so much that you see happening for people. And what I like to bring in and what our clinicians really like to bring in is the idea of why are people acting in this way? So sometimes we might have a preconceived notion. I think sometimes when folks are maybe working in the correctional environment, there's these ideas that already exist or implicit biases. So being able to pull from all these different areas and going, oh, well, I wonder if it's the way that they're experiencing even their pod that they're housed in, or who their roommate is, or, if they have a budding mental health condition, or what's going on with their family. So there's so many dynamics. It's really its own microcosm, the correctional environment. So you see so much interplay of the systems within that microcosm. And then there's everything outside of the correctional institution as well.
So I think it's pretty interesting. I'm a psychologist by training. And when I think about the history of how criminal behavior gets understood and storied, my profession played an important role, one I'm not necessarily so proud of, in the sense that, at one point it was looked at like people committed an act, they transgressed in some way, right? And then the society decided, well, they would have to do something to atone for that. But then psychologists come in and they start assessing people for criminality, which is really interesting because then there's this assumption, and maybe it happened accidentally. I don't know quite how it happened, but that people have criminality embedded inside of them somehow. And that seemed like an important shift because now we moved away from people who committed acts that the society said were criminal, right? To now dealing with people who are criminals. And I'm wondering if you can discuss some of that and how you make sense of criminality and the mental health work you do.
Yeah. Oh gosh, great question as well. I really don't love the term like criminality as a social worker. I really try to reserve it for folks who are really embedded in that lifestyle. Like, because when I'm thinking of like the correctional environment, sometimes folks get really attached to that word, as you're pointing out. So I feel like my role in behavioral health and as a social worker coming into the system is to try to move people away from that when we're in the system. So if you really have someone who is really steadfast about maybe hurting others, doesn't care if that, has implications for other people, et cetera, et cetera. That's one thing, but that's kind of like an extreme. So much of the folks that we have substance use disorder, and I don't attach the criminality to that necessarily because folks have something that's often untreated or they're trying to get a need met. So a lot of the work that we do in our system is trying to revamp the word like manipulation because I think that sometimes goes hand in hand with the term criminality. And we really like to look at, yeah, people are adaptive. They're finding ways to get their needs met in society. And yeah, sometimes it does bring them to the system, but it's not a perfect system. If we had more community resources, folks wouldn't necessarily matriculate here. So I think it's far and few in between with the folks who are really criminogenic, which is probably a little bit taboo in my field, but that's really how I feel about it.
Can you say a little bit more about it being taboo in your field? Like, how do you mean?
Yeah. Oh, I think I have this very interesting intersectionality for folks that are kind of in the same shoes as myself, where you're working in corrections and also in the social work field. So, being in corrections, speaking there first, there's a lot of ideas around like punishment or people being bad. And I don't like those binaries, which goes along with what we were kind of just talking about. Like, there's so much to people. None of us should be judged on our worst day or something that leads us to a correctional institution. So we really do practice that way. But the other thing that I think is so interesting about the nexus of this work is there's a lot of push in social work for abolitionism. And I'm not someone who says, like, wonderful, like, I love prisons, but I think it's important to remember that as social workers, our role really has been going in and infiltrating systems and trying to make change that way. So it's a really interesting nexus to sit in because people have a lot of feelings on both sides of where we sit as social workers in this work.
For sure. Yeah, and I think it's complicated because it's easier on the outside, as someone who is interested in abolitionist ideas, it's easy on the outside sometimes to talk about how things should be abolished. But I think Miriam Kaba talks about, abolition really isn't about abolishing anything. It's about building something new. She talks about like a million tiny experiments. And sometimes the way we start those experiments is by actually embedding ourselves in these systems. And I'm wondering, on that note, day to day, I mean, what do you find that is central to your practice in working with people who are in correctional facilities?
Mm. I think probably most central is thinking about the idea that this could be someone's sister, brother, mother, father, right? Like just being in your humanity. And again, like one of the things that we often say, I think just within our work in our correctional sphere where I'm at is the idea of people as people. Like we're all just human beings sitting down. It's very Rogerian, which I think is really great. We're just people coming to the table and what can we do to help move someone along and whatever support they might need in this very challenging environment.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, obviously, you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, but I would assume the mental health needs of the folks you serve can vary greatly. Would that be right?
Totally.
And so then how do you design things to meet those needs, those varied needs? I mean, I think most people who are listening to this, it would be fair to say, are probably functioning in outpatient sort of settings. Maybe they have worked in inpatient settings during their training. Some people do that as a career, but most people don't. And so I'm wondering if you could help us understand how on the inside of a correctional facility or in a prison setting, how you attempt to meet the varied needs of mental health of the people you serve.
Oh, such a good question. I feel like flexibility is the name of the game. So I remember graduating from school, right? And it's like, well, what is going to be your practice modality? And I always found that just, wow, why do I have to pick one when people don't just fit into one tiny box? Especially when, to your point, there are so many different needs that are within this setting. And it's not uncommon to have folks with intellectual disabilities. It's not uncommon to have people who are super psychotic and really struggling in that regard. And you just can't meet everyone with the same modality. So I think you have to be able to know this is going to be a cohort that we do a lot of processing with. And then vice versa. This might be a cohort that we can do a lot of structure or maybe really dig into a CBT model. But you can't always do that. Sometimes you have to have more processing just to meet where the folks in the group will be. That's always been the most dynamic piece for me in this work. You have to be able to be on your toes, and you're going to have different skill sets within those groups that you might be running, or even an individual. You really have to be able to meet folks where they're at.
Yeah, what you're saying is really interesting to me, and I think, clinicians, no matter where they're practicing, could benefit from this, and you tell me if I have this right or not, but I think what you're saying is that we kinda have to create, quote, unquote, "treatments that are made to order, that are unique and serve the people in front of us," rather than having, like a script or a manual that we follow. Is that do I have that part right?
1,000%.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think that a lot of times the assumption from the outside would be that in prison settings, for example, that you would have to follow a script, right? That everything would have to be scripted. Because I think the sense there is that, well, the lives of the people in the prison, for all intents and purposes, seem really scripted, right? You do this at this time. I mean, everything's sort of, step by step by the book. And I guess in terms of mental health, sometimes it's assumed that, that's how it goes as well. But I'm hearing that perhaps there's some flexibility and some leeway in how that treatment happens.
There's certainly like guides and models and things that we do to be like evidence based, but there's also, again, that wiggle room in thinking about how do you actually meet the human being in front of you. So I really like how you posed that question.
What are you talking about meeting the human being in front of you? Do you notice the needs of the population you serve as being dramatically different from the needs of people who haven't been in a prison setting before?
I think some of the pieces that are probably, maybe this is expected for folks on the outside, I'm not sure, but the trauma is really significant. I mean, people's ACE scores are often 4 and above. And so, like, one of the things we also like to do to kind of frame things when we have the opportunity is look at the PCEs as well and try to give people something that builds resiliency so that they can see, yeah, these things have happened to you, but here are the things that are positive that have also offset that. So I think doing that has been really powerful when we can interject that piece as well. But all our folks who come into our particular system, we do their ACE score upon intake just to make sure that we're like seeing what the needs are, and that actually infiltrates some of their assignments in terms of group. So for substance use treatment, for example, we would use that ACE score to also then recommend whether they need a more trauma intensive substance use program, or if the, like, we call it tier 1 and tier 2. So tier 2, if that's more fitting or not. Tier 1 would be where we put people who have more intensive trauma needs.
You're talking about ACE, that's what, adverse childhood experiences, if I'm remembering the
Yeah.
acronym correctly. Can you talk some about why you found that to be useful in the work you're doing?
I think it does give us a way to numerically organize what we've got in front of us for folks coming into our system, and we try to track all of that. So we've got some years worth of data on that. I'd have to dig into it to see what our actual mean across everything is right now. But generally speaking, people are 4 and above. And really, you're looking at the culmination of so many different intersectionalities, whether it's race, gender, whether it's looking at substance use history, whether it's looking at folks who have been in the foster care system, whatever it might be, it just certainly is interesting to look at where they've been and then also kind of inform like where they are. So, one of the things that we did when we did this on our more intensive mental health unit was looking at what they came in with for an ACE score. And then what was so remarkable about that particular milieu, some of our folks who were doing better, like our more chronic folks who are getting to a place where they might be moving on soon or they're just really practicing their wellness, they were like, well, can I do one for where I'm at now? Which I found so intriguing. They were looking at this is where I've been, but I'm not really like resonating with that now. This is where I am.
Yep. I'm imagining that for folks that are incarcerated, that can produce a sense of stress in itself for people. I mean, people's autonomy and their freedom can feel like it's been taken away, and I'm wondering how you work with that in your work, because a lot of times the way we work with things, if in mental health, if people are struggling, is it's like, well, maybe perhaps there are changes in your everyday life that you can make to feel differently. And in this case, I mean, if someone is feeling like, their freedom's been taken, I guess you can help them deal with that in a certain way, but they can't fix it. Like they can't leave the prison and get their freedom back. So in some ways, you're dealing with a stress that can't necessarily be changed in that moment.
Oh, absolutely. Some of the interesting parts of that would be folks who are coming in maybe off of a capital crime and really feel aligned with, they might not have gone through their whole legal process yet, but they might feel aligned with the idea of like, I'm not getting out of here. And then you also might have those folks who have been sentenced and they aren't getting out of a correctional institution. That's not to also minimize that there's folks who get I don't know, like a year and some change, and they still are really stressed about that because all of it, right, can be very stressful. As you point out, your freedom is taken away. But you are so right. You cannot fix, you cannot magically take a wand and make everything better when folks are facing a lifetime of incarceration. So some of the work we do sometimes is based on radical acceptance or thinking about meaning and purpose. When we have folks who are older and really kind of coming to terms with like, this is it, this is where I'm going to be for the end of my life, we really look at like narrative therapy. How do you own and claim your story? So I think one of the things that's kind of a common misconception in corrections is that real like mental health work, meaningful work doesn't happen. And I love to challenge that. Like, there is really some enriching stuff that you are able to do with folks in this because it's a closed environment. So you are able to really take time, and not necessarily do like the therapeutic hour that insurance is billed on. It gives you some freedom to do things a little bit differently.
I'm wondering if you could share some stories that come to mind where something happened on the inside that maybe couldn't have happened in quite the same way on the outside to a good therapeutic effect.
One of the folks who I've worked with who had been in the system many years, decades, and has really struggled in psychiatric stability throughout most of their trajectory. I think, like, kind of a caveat to that, one of the things that can be so painstaking and challenging to see is the folks that you work with who are just not psychiatrically well, and they really haven't been probably since the inception of, an alleged crime, and they wound up in this system. They wound up in the carceral system. So I think just thinking about how you can help folks who really should, in a perfect world, be somewhere in some other mental health system, but there is no place for that at this juncture. And being able to really get real about like some of that end of life stuff and what is the meaning of your life and how do you make meaning? I'm sure that happens in outpatient settings, but I'm just thinking about the way that it looks in a carceral setting. It's so raw. I mean, because there's no other wiggle room or avoidance. Like, we both know what we're looking at as the therapist and the patient. There is no getting out of this dynamic. So you really get to look at things with folks, I feel like, in a way that you don't always get sometimes in some other settings.
Does anything come to mind specifically, like where maybe someone had a particular insight or they were able to make meaning of their situation in a way that was surprising, unexpected, interesting?
I'm thinking of a person that I did some work with, and they have done a lot of work around problem sexual behavior, a lot of work. And for them, being able to like work with women was really off the table for most of their lives. They got to a place, and some of this has to do with age and circumstance and smaller milieus, right? But I really think that I was surprised, and this person was surprised that they were able to sit in front of a female and have like an exchange about where they've been with this particular aspect of their life and be able to move through that in real time with a female therapist. So I would say in terms of like insight and kind of awe, that's always an example that sticks out for me because I never felt like it was accessible to them before.
Yeah, I love that example. And you bring up something really interesting there, which is being a woman working in these settings. Now, of course, women are incarcerated as well. I think often the image people have is of men being incarcerated when you first conjure up an image. And this makes me wonder, what has it been like as a woman working in these settings?
It is definitely its own set of challenges. I've also had 2 pregnancies. You can't really hide a pregnancy, right? So, working as a clinical person and working with both women and men, there's been some real visceral experiences, which makes a lot of sense. I think when you think about it, even from the female side of things and folks who've experienced pregnancy themselves. So that's one aspect. And then in terms of what always kind of mystifies me, it's I'll say this and people will probably not believe it, but it's really one of the safest jobs I think you can have. There's certain environments where it doesn't always feel that way. So I don't want to like market it as like total safety, but you have folks around you all the time, meaning like correctional staff should something go awry. Versus when I think of some of the jobs I've had in the community, going into people's homes, there's not that safeguard. So being able, I mean, you don't do therapy generally with a correctional person there with you, but they're around. And so if there was a response that needed to happen, it's pretty quick, which is something that makes a difference in this work. But yeah, I think being a woman in that environment, it is a different experience than peers who are male. Some of the things that I also find super interesting is the difference between the way folks respond to women who are incarcerated and men who are incarcerated. Men have some really big expressions of anger, and we often can be like, oh, yeah, that's fine. That's what they do. But when women do that same thing, there's a huge response. And so when you really just break that down, like there's so many biases that come to play in our own responses to that.
Ooh, boy. Yeah, there's a lot in what you just said here, and taking notes on multiple different aspects of this. So one is the idea of safety. I'm glad you raised that because I think this is something people wonder about, especially students or people who are considering working in these settings. And what I hear you saying is that it actually generally feels like a really safe environment. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and maybe why you think it is that people get that wrong. Like when you entered this work, did you have fear for your safety and then discover like, oh, actually this feels pretty safe?
I had to get my footing, so I think that's a brilliant point. I would be shocked if someone came into this and was like, "Oh yeah, like full send, I'm comfortable." That might be actually a little concerning, but I think there's things like, for example, often when we have interns or people who are applying to be an employee with us, you come into the facility first because there's something you'll notice. Like I notice still to this day, my breathing changes when those doors shut. Like there's a visceral response to being locked into an environment, and we get to leave, right? So like even in knowing that and not having the same experience as someone who's actively incarcerated, it's still something where you notice I'm having a response to this. And so I think folks are going to have to realize, through their own experience, whether it's a fit for them. But what I would say is once it's a fit, if it's a fit you're in, I think it's something that you kind of just jump into because the work is never the same. I feel like there's so much opportunity for being creative. There's a lot of systems work. So for anyone who gets excited about the idea of working within systems, it's the perfect opportunity for that. And people, I think, they're often overlooked in this environment. This might be the first time someone actually gets good treatment. And so, what I like to think about as myself as a practitioner, I'm hoping that for folks who are returning to the society, that I'm setting them up to have a good experience with the next therapist they might come across.
What let you know that this work was a good fit for you? Like when did you know?
I have always been really fascinated by this idea that society thinks there are people that need to be kept away from one another. Truly, since for as long as I can remember. And so I knew that I really wanted to do something that was either inpatient psych or something that was in like a locked setting. And what I've really found is that there's kind of an overlap in marriage of the psychiatric piece within our correctional environment because with the lack of community resources and infrastructure, we've become kind of the de facto placement for that. So it's really, if you like mental health and you find that enriching, there is a lot of opportunity for someone within the correctional environment.
Now, a couple minutes ago, you were mentioning some of the differences between working with men versus women in these settings, and not just the difference between working with them, but also the difference in the stories that are told about men and women. And you gave an example of anger. I'm wondering if you could speak some more about some of those differences and some of maybe the unique challenges in working with men and working with women in a society that has particular stories that like the one you mentioned that somehow women can't get angry.
I think another flip in what you're asking is I've had like the same kind of response happen when men are crying or tearful. And it's very much like, oh my gosh, we need mental health right now. And it's like, wait, wait, wait. Do they even want to speak to mental health right now? They might not. If it's normal grief or grieving, I mean, that's okay. So we've really tried to do some education around some of that, like on both sides. So when it's women who might be having big reactions, okay. But, was there anything that was actually like violent or threatening or like we were going to a higher threshold, or is this just a normal emotive response but it feels big because it's a female, and vice versa? With a male, if a male is crying, is this just a normal response? Is this normal sadness, or is there actually something more concerning? So I find that a really interesting part of the work. I think naturally what's come like up in our setting is that folks gravitate easier towards the concept of having to be trauma informed for females. Our system, I think, does a really nice job of this, but I know this can be something that folks experience in the carceral setting with men too, right? Like there's a lot of trauma. There's a lot of trauma that's not reported. And so being able to help kind of marry the idea that trauma for folks who are incarcerated, this is a big thing. And that's why we do like those ACE scores when they come in. This is a thing that we have to work with, and we have to have that trauma informed approach to everyone.
Mm. Yes, something I liked in what you just said is like, do they even want mental health right now? Right. And asking that question, because boy, just asking that question can go a long way. And I'm thinking too, again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but perhaps there are folks in these settings who aren't often consulted about such things. They're just going to be told what happens there. And just by asking the question, it feels like it returns some autonomy for the preferred response to them.
Autonomy is a huge piece, and I love that you use that word because we actually use it a lot in our work. Like, we're trying to find places where we can interject choice for people. I think another thing that's important for folks to know if they were interested in this work, like, mental health is not mandated, right? So that's the only place in most settings is if you're in a specialized, like, mental health unit within these environments, but otherwise people have choice in that. Same with things like problem sexual behavior treatment, substance use treatment. What we really do is we screen everyone on intake and we look at what are your clinical needs, but people do have a right to choose whether or not they want to engage in some of that.
Wondering if you could talk some about interacting with other staff. So, and not just mental health staff. I mean, obviously, I would imagine you interact with psychiatrists, for example. I would imagine also you interact with officers and others in the environment. I'm wondering if you can talk some about those interactions, the collaborations, and maybe some of the challenges that exist.
Yeah, when we can be partners, meaning behavioral health and correctional folks, I think that's where honestly the magic happens. So, a couple of different examples. One that I'm thinking of in particular in like the mental health specialized units, one of the things that we might need to do is we might have someone who really needs some treatment, but they are really volatile or dangerous because oftentimes for those specialized environments, that might be part of the criteria. You have to have a higher threshold of need in order to get into that. So we have done before therapy with the patient is aware that this is how we're going to do it just to keep everyone safe. But we're going to do it together with these folks who have specialized correctional training. So in the system that I work in, that's a thing. We have folks who have specialized correctional experience in mental health. So in terms of like where they're placed within the correctional environment, they have interest. They have to kind of vote themselves forward to do that work. And so they already have an interest. Oftentimes they've already worked in the field in some capacity or done studies, and they partner really well. We also have folks sometimes where it is more challenging, and I think when some of this really started, that was a big challenge was like the buy-in that behavioral health can actually make an impact. And I think over time, the more that you have like consistent folks within the system, consistent faces, meaning like staff that stick around, you start to build those relationships with one another, and the trust becomes better in terms of like, here's what I'm seeing clinically, how can we marry this with a security approach, because we do have to make sure people are safe and, residents and staff. So I think that's something that I've seen really go well when we can connect.
Yeah, what have you learned about how to best facilitate that? Because, I can see how, like, when it starts clicking on all cylinders, how that collaboration could work really well. I could also imagine some scenarios where it could almost feel like they're competing objectives, and I'm wondering what you've learned about, helping along a collaborative environment in this setting.
Yeah. I think it really comes down to, again, like the same way that we might approach work with residents, we approach it with one another. Like, where are we in our humanity, right? Like, just because someone has a strong approach today and might view something very differently than maybe we do as behavioral health, is there room for us to keep having collaboration and discussion to maybe help move that person a little bit more center? I think also, like, they can keep us in line in terms sometimes of like, "Hey, this person, we have a lot of concern in terms of safety. How can we make sure that you are safe and still doing your job?" Because at the end of the day, we can't do any of our work unless we're safe. And that's kind of why I, like, come up with this approach of like, yeah, it's actually like a really safe environment in a lot of ways because you do have that married approach. But to really answer your question, I think it's just time spent with folks that are doing the work, who are on the floor. Being a correctional officer, I think, is exhausting work that sometimes gets overlooked, and they see a lot. So there's a lot of room for trauma there. There's a lot of room for domestic violence and substance use disorders to manifest. So it's really important that we understand what they're seeing and try to like marry that with our approach in terms of what we need to do for the residents.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm wondering if you could talk some about racism and how this shows up, because I mean, when we look at the criminal legal system, we see Black and Brown folks disproportionately being incarcerated, and so and sometimes, the way that racism works, I mean, I would argue racism is always systemic, and the way it works sometimes isn't apparent on the surface. You have to look a little deeper to see how that works, and yet it's can still be extremely influential even when it's not apparent on the surface. And I'm wondering, in your role, how racism might show up and how you attempt to navigate it.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So I think some examples that come to mind might even be like the idea of a watch status. So to kind of clarify what that is, if someone is unsafe to themselves or others, then we would have them on some type of special observation status in order to make sure that they are safe. I think what I've seen is that folks don't even realize necessarily that they're perpetuating racism, but they might have put someone who is Black or Brown on a longer watch and observation restrictive status than they would with someone with very comparable dynamics who's white. And so it's kind of challenging that we do talk a lot about that in our teams, behavioral health wise, and how can we then message that out? And it's a dance because you don't want to like totally off put your other half of your team, right? And that's like your security team. You don't want to say, okay, you're blatantly being racist. You have to find a way to be like, this is what I'm observing. Might there be some other reason that we're kind of thinking about this person this way? And what I usually like to do is kind of do some type of like case example. Like, okay, so I'm wondering about this person that we had before, and these were their dynamics, right? And most of the time it's listing like what were the safety concerns. And then vice versa with someone that maybe who's in front of us right now. What seems different between this case and the last case? Just to kind of get people to be a little less guarded.
Yeah, I really appreciate that example, and also the way you describe going about it, right? Because it's one thing to recognize a pattern of inequity, right? And it's another thing then to try to address that within the system and address it in a way that other people can hear it and work with it. Yeah, one other thing I wanted to bounce off of you was recidivism rates, right?
Mm.
Like, what I hear frequently is how the recidivism rates are so high, and then sometimes grouped within why they are high is people will say, well, that's because these folks just get caged and they don't get any mental health services. They don't really, and they're just sort of thrown back into a world then that is sort of setting them up to come right back to the same place. And from an outsider's perspective, I do definitely think there's some truth to that. But I'm wondering, and of course, I would imagine that y'all could use some more funding and things of that nature. Like, yeah, I see you laughing about that. Yeah, couldn't we all? But and in the current state of the world, the funding seems in even more peril. So obviously, there are a lot of different factors at play here, a lot of different systemic variables, and recidivism rates seem to be fairly high. And I'm wondering how you view that, and do you try and are you mindful of that in the work that you're doing? Is that a goal? Is to try and help prevent recidivism, or is it someone else's responsibility?
Ooh, okay. This is great. It's a really good question. When I think of this, my systems brain goes off to start because I've always, I don't know, there's something about the idea of like recidivism. Like, but what? That tells us like this number, but it doesn't really tell us the story. So when I think going back to again the idea of like the Community Mental Health Act and then how we had deinstitutionalization, and there still are not enough psychiatric beds across our country. we have folks who show bizarre behaviors, or maybe they do something because their thought process is disordered, or maybe they're under the influence, could be anything. And then they filter to our correctional system, just in vast, I think, quantities compared to maybe where they could end up in a psychiatric institution. So we don't have enough there. So that kind of funnels people into just begin with. But then I think about like all the layers. If I hadn't done so much work with our significant severe mental illness folks, I would probably look at this differently, but I think each time you're working with someone, your goal is to try to move them forward even incrementally, knowing that because they've been probably to get to us through all these other parts of the system, or they're not landing in the right system, they're probably going to come back in some capacity. So, one example of that I use, we had an individual who came back into our care in a specialized unit at least 7 times. And so some people, right, when they think of recidivism, they go, "Oh my gosh, so nothing's working." And so I like to go back a little bit in that case example and go, "Okay, when we first had that person, they were adamant. They would not accept any resource from us. Nothing. We could barely even get them to maybe consider taking psychiatric medications in the community." And so each time they took more of a resource each juncture. And at this point, we haven't seen that person, knock on wood, for some years now. And so it takes time, I think, for people, especially when you think of how damaging it can be to be a person with mental illness in a correctional environment. A lot of your autonomy's already been taken out when you're in the community. People telling you that your thoughts aren't real, that you have disordered right ideas, and that you need medication in order to be a functioning human being in society. And so hearing that is something that people naturally buck up against. And you can just expect that with some of these mental health conditions, they are going to go off of those medications. And again, this isn't everyone, but just some of these specialized folks where, yeah, we're going to see them again. How do we make this more impactful? How do they have a better relationship with us when they come back next time than what they did to start?
Something I think I hear you saying is that patience is required in this process. Is that right?
Yes, very much.
How do you foster that patience? I feel like this is something in many environments for clinicians that is difficult, probably just for human beings in general, but we're speaking about clinicians here. And I'm wondering how you kind of foster that because in the story you just shared, I think it would be easy to get demoralized and to feel like, oh, this was a failure. And the way I hear you telling the story is a little different than that. And it seems to be highlighting patience and and there's like a trajectory that people are moving in the right direction.
Yeah. I think that is a key part, this idea of patience. And it starts with the language and discussions that we have as a team, and just thinking about, okay, what are our wants for this patient, and what is this person's right to, autonomy and self-determination? Because there's a place where they get that choice, unless they're a danger to themselves or others and it's imminent upon time of release. They get to make choice. And it's not a crime to be unwell, psychiatrically unwell in the world. And so being able to help our team just understand that that's part of this person's process is really huge. And I think seeing the successes over time is also part of folks' buy-in. So that same person that I was telling you about, on one of his last admissions, he, was very emotional. We do these team meetings weekly or as needed for folks. And he was like, isn't it crazy I had to come to prison in order to find, family? And he's talking about the people, the providers on the unit, because he really has become that connected over those, years. And another thing that in this environment that we do that might be a little controversial and different than others is they stay connected with us via, phone. So they have the number to our admissions coordinator. They have the number to our unit manager, so that when things happen in the outside world or they need a little bit of support, we're there. So that's kind of the whole idea of doing things a little bit differently.
Yeah. As you're talking about this too, is thinking that often when people are struggling and they come to see us, I mean, we can be of support through conversation or interventions or resources, all those things. But often, I think what we're trying to do is help people feel connected to others in the world, right? Whether it's familial relationships, where they have some sense of a support system. And there are some supports that are built into the environments you're in that you're talking about. And also, maybe some of the people that they would most want to be supportive, they don't get access to them in the same ways that people on the outside do. And I'm wondering how you navigate that, helping people feel that sense of community and support in an environment that I'm imagining can sometimes feel pretty isolating.
Mm. I think it depends on each milieu and each environment. I think in a lot of ways, it's easier in a mental health unit to foster that. So you have a bit more of like a closed setting within the closed setting. And there's certain criteria, basically, that folks have some type of mental health condition and higher level of need. And that allows for everyone to be on the same page. Another thing that's done differently in that particular milieu is folks are given monies for participating in their treatment. And that's another way to get buy-in and to also help prevent some things like strong arming. So when I think of going back to our initial conversation about the idea of criminality, a system like that would be like, that's criminal behavior. And we go, no, people are trying to get their needs met. Would you be doing the same thing to get something if you had nothing and you were incarcerated? So that's kind of where we try to like level the playing field and give people more access to things. In that environment, it's not uncommon or controversial at this point for someone to come upstairs, meet with the team, have coffee or tea, normalizing things, doing more Zooms or whatever modality we're using these days for the video conferencing with their family or friends in the community, getting folks involved with school. So when I think of that mental health environment, that's a big part of it. And then when I think of the female population, it's not that this does not resonate the same way with our males. But with females, we know that recidivism rates, going back to that topic too, are dramatically higher when folks don't have connection with their kids or when they lose custody of their kids. So finding ways, if it is appropriate, within there's obviously things that happen in, DHS settings as well that we have to be mindful of. But if there is no kind of restriction, we really try to make those connections happen for people because we know that they're important and trying to get them out of the system.
I appreciate what you were saying about, um, kind of people's responses, and you're kind of like, well, wouldn't you do this to get your needs met? And it does feel to me that people are always responding in the world. I remember doing this news interview with like a local news station. I don't know, going on 20 years ago now. And I remember the news anchor asked me, she goes like, Dr. Heath, why do people do drugs? And the way I responded was, well, because they work really well. And I don't think she was anticipating that response. Now, but it's true as I see it, is that people do drugs often because they work really well. Now, if you're asking me, is this a great long-term solution? I don't know. I mean, that's a different conversation, but people are responding. They're always responding to things in their life. And when you put the story in context, often it makes sense. And one thing I've heard as a theme in our conversation today, I think, and you tell me if I've got this wrong, but that's how you view folks too, is that they're always responding to things and doing what they can to get their needs met. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's just normalizing. Like, I think in our world, we like to pathologize sometimes a little bit too much, and it's just normalizing when things are, in fact, a normal response to especially prison. Like, that's an abnormal dynamic to be in. I think we've kind of because we live in this country where mass incarceration is a thing, we kind of normalize in some ways, like, "Oh, that's just people go to prison." It's like, that is an abnormal dynamic to be in. So if you just kind of put yourself in those shoes, would you be doing these things to get your needs met? It makes it a lot less personal for people too, I think, in that regard, because people put a lot of energy, I find, in this work to trying to help people like move forward in their lives or, maybe they feel a connection to what their story is. And so if folks have these kind of ways of trying to get their needs met, sometimes folks personalize it. It's like never about you, right? Like these are things that sometimes folks are doing just to try to get by.
Yes, for sure. You brought up mass incarceration, and I really appreciated your point there where the people aren't abnormal here. It's the system and what's happening that is abnormal. And there are no easy solutions to this. I understand that. Given your time and expertise in doing this work, though, I'm wondering, imagine that you had the power to do whatever you wanted to do, right, to these systems. I'm wondering how you would begin. I know there's no easy answer, but how you would begin to approach this issue of mass incarceration. Like, what might you do differently than what is currently being done?
Oh my goodness. I wish we could give a lot of funds to housing, right? If we could just get housing like more organized. I think of some of the awful ways that we've seen recently, like structures being made in our world. And I'm like, why can't you make a housing location for folks who need it? Why can't we put more monies into mental health treatment and things even like day programs, right? Where people have a place to go, just stuff like that that normalizes that people exist in the world, whether they're transient or, whatever it is, whether they're going through a hard time. I heard this saying once that we're all like one failed relationship away from being homeless. Like, there's all these things that are just a fine line for us as human beings, even becoming incarcerated. You think of someone who, drinks and then gets like an OUI or something, right? Like, the line is really thin, and people don't always realize that. How can we put the monies into things like substance use treatment, keeping it more community before we get to a place where incarceration is even an option?
That as you're talking, I'm just thinking there are so many different levels that you have to tend to here, right? So many different, I get like this series of concentric circles of systems that you have to try and deal with. And I appreciate your systemic lens. And then at the end of the day, you're sitting in front of a person or you're sitting in front of a group of people and you're doing work that is presumably pretty intimate. And it strikes me that it would not behoove us to just look at this at a systemic level or an individualist level or a small group level. It's kind of like we have to tend to all of these as I'm listening to you talk today. I'm wondering if you see that similarly.
I totally agree with you. I mean, there's so many areas that intersect here that lead to potentially someone becoming incarcerated. So how do we make the world better and more accessible for people who need help?
How do we make the world better? This is the question. I think all of us at some level that get into this field are wondering that. All right. In closing, if someone has interest in doing this work, what would you suggest as a first step or a series of steps that they might do to begin to pursue it?
Part of it would pertain to what you want to do with your education. So, like, what line are you going in? Is it something clinical or is it something more skill based? All those, there's room to kind of navigate in. Are you someone who likes case management? And then, aside from that path, it's pretty accessible, I think, for the state that you're in, who runs or oversees the correctional system, and reaching out to them. They will put you in contact with whoever the behavioral health provider is there. It's not necessarily always folks who have like a state email that you can find because it's a lot of contracted companies. So I would just kind of think about that. How can you reach out to the department and see where they can funnel you?
And if students are listening now and they're still in a graduate program, I mean, are there particular classes they should take, or are there like certifications they should seek, external supervision that they should seek? Like, for those folks in particular, are there any steps that they can take now while they're still in their formalized training?
Yeah, I'm thinking of folks who might be in, for example, because I'm most familiar, like a social work program. So your first year where it's not your clinical concentration, if you know that this is maybe where you want to go for your second year internship or after, reaching out, seeing if you can talk to someone, and then getting some ideas about what it might take to like apply for an internship with them. I think there's more energy around this. Folks are kind of competitive in getting these internships these days, which was not always the case when I first started getting into it. So that's exciting, and I would say reach out early and often.
Brooke, I really appreciate you joining us today. I could go on for another hour. I often in these conversations find myself saying that at the end, I have this list of questions that I would still want to ask. So maybe, we'll have to do this again, but I appreciate all the information that you gave us today. And I appreciate your approach, frankly. I think sometimes there are stereotypes about how mental health works, in these systems and in these, prisons and incarcerated settings and so forth. And it's really heartening to hear about how you're doing the work and you're considering broader systems. I heard you use the word humanity 4 or 5 times, right? All that's really heartening to hear. So I learned a lot in the conversation, but I also just want to say I appreciate the sort of heart that you bring to the work.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.